Good afternoon. I am Valerie Birdfort, an instructor for the School of Information Science at the University of South Carolina. I'm so pleased to be here today for Dr. Cook. Welcome to the Baker Diversity Series lecture with Dr. Renate Chancellor. I even checked how to say it, and then it didn't want to come out of my mouth. Some housekeeping items before we get started this afternoon. We are using GoToWebinar, so you are all muted and your cameras are off. There is no chat feature in GoToWebinar, but we do encourage you to post questions as you're listening, and we will keep track of those and get those answered for you at the end of the lecture this afternoon. If you go to your dashboard, you will see where you can type in your questions. A recording of this session will be added to the Augusta Baker Diversity Series website, as well as a transcript of today's presentation. And now I will introduce you to today's speaker. Dr. Renate Chancellor is Chair and Associate Professor in the Department of Library and Information Science at the Catholic University of America. She received her master's and PhD in Information Studies from UCLA. She's deeply concerned with achieving equity for people who are made vulnerable by systems of oppression. Her research focuses on human information behavior, particularly in legal environments, and diversity and social justice in library and information science. Her book on the life and legacy of E.J. Josey was released in 2020, and today's talk will discuss the life and professional career of librarian, educator, and activist E.J. Josey. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over and get our afternoon started. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you, Valerie, for that wonderful invitation. Also, thanks to Dr. Nicole Cook for the invitation to speak today, as well as Grace for helping, and everyone else at University of South Carolina. It is so wonderful to come speak today. I'm very honored to speak, particularly at the Augusta Baker lecture, diversity lecture series. I consider Augusta Baker, as well as E.J. Josey and several other African-American libraries as a cadre of librarians who who pioneered services for the profession. And so it's just wonderful to talk today for the Augusta Baker lecture. Before we get started, I also want just to tell you that for the last year, I have been doing a book tour, albeit virtual, on E.J. Josey. And so it's also wonderful just to talk to your community and just to get the word out there about contributions of Josey, as well as other librarians of color who have made significant contributions to our profession. So if you find anything that I may say that may be inspiring, feel free to tweet. I'm very active on Twitter. Here's my handle, and if you want to do hashtag E.J. Josey, that would be great. So happy to have conversations long after this talk. So I'm talking about E.J. Josey, and one of the things when I started out to do a research on him, I wanted to explore various aspects of his life. I kind of heard a little bit about what he did. But I wasn't really sure. I didn't know his full contribution. So I really embarked on this effort, as a researcher. And because he had such presence in the American Library Association, as well as just as a librarian, I knew he had leadership. And so I wanted to look at him. I wanted to see really, or kind of test his ability to lead, or his leadership skills, or, how effective, like the efficacy of his leadership. And so I really looked at Josey as a leader. And if you see this word block here, you see all these terms that are related to leadership. You see management, which is quite different than leadership, but you see, other terms like people, place, organizations. And so one of the things that I did with Josey, I looked at him as a leader within organizations like the American Library Association, organizations like, for example, like the libraries he worked. So I really wanted to look at his leadership. And when looking at his leadership, I used it as a framework, and I settled on this framework of transformational leadership. And I wanted, because I kind of knew a lot of the things that he did, but I wanted to see really, was his work, was his efforts, the efforts that he made, was it really transformative? And McGregor Burns defines transformative leadership as a person who guides, directs, and influences others to bring about fundamental change, both externally and internally. And I think it's important for us to think, we often hear the term leadership, but I think it's also important to think about where we are today in terms of leadership, not only in the profession, but also in LIS spaces as well. LIS educators, LIS instructors, librarians, information professionals in general. So it's really important to think about leadership, because I contend that we need people like Augusta Baker, people like E.J. Josey, and a whole host of others that were not afraid. They were not afraid to enact change, to bring about change, to change things. Transformative, that's really what it means, to make some shift, to alter something. And so I chose this transformative leadership as a framework to really look at. And transformative leadership, this model by Bernard Bass, really has 4 components. And as illustrated here, it speaks to how influential a person is. It speaks to how a person if a person can empower others, if a person can go to new heights or take an organization to new heights, if people are inspirational. So these are the elements of Bass's leadership framework, and this is the framework that I use when doing my research on Josey for the book. And 2 guiding questions really led me. One was, what was the impact of his leadership on the profession, and how did he transform the profession? So these were the 2 guiding questions. So, but in order to really look at Josey, what I found is that we have to put him within some type of contextual background. And I'll get more into his life a little bit later, but I just want to start with just giving us some context. So we have to go all the way back to 1876, where most people think that's when we founded the American library, the modern library profession. And so just keep in mind that wasn't actually that long ago, it was 1876. In 1880, we have Jim Crow laws. Many of you guys were aware of what these laws were in the South, which basically were laws that prevented Black people, that were geared towards Black people. Basically, there were racial laws that Black people could not share same spaces with white people. And if you did, then you were killed or you were brutalized. And so Jim Crow really proliferated through the South from 1880, early 19th century, all the way through the 20th century. 1896 is Plessy versus Ferguson. That law pretty much supported this whole idea of separate but equal, which said separate Blacks there are separate spaces that they can participate in. They couldn't go into the same hotels as white counterparts. They couldn't drink from the same water fountain. And so Plessy versus Ferguson basically was enacted several years later to really continue the oppression of Black. 1936 was significant in ALA history, the American Library Association history, because it was pretty much the first time that they created policy on the treatment of Blacks. So it was at the 1936 conference in Richmond, Virginia, that the organizers of ALA made an effort to invite a lot of the Black librarians to participate. Because keep in mind, although ALA was always founded on core principles of democracy and inviting of everyone, but we also had, in 1936, we also were in the period of Jim Crow and this whole separate but equal laws that existed. So ALA had a conference in Richmond, Virginia. It was at that conference where Black members, Black librarians were not treated equally. They could not come into the same hotel space. They could not they cannot dine with the white counterparts. They couldn't fully participate in the conference. So it was at that particular conference in Richmond, Virginia, where ALA implemented policy which said that they no longer would hold a conference where all their members could not fully participate. So we moved to 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. This is probably very, many of you guys know that this really was the case that really desegregated school systems where people can go, Blacks and whites can actually go to school together. So this was at the beginning, and it's often marked as the period that started the civil rights movement, although there is evidence that it started long before that. This is usually the date, or 1954 is usually the date that is really known for the start of the civil rights movement. And then 1964 is the Civil Rights Act. And in 1964, this is where you finally have law that really tore down all the segregation policies. And we all know, even though laws were enacted, behavior did not change. People's thinking towards Black people didn't change. And so we still have, even though we had this law that said legally you cannot discriminate, people still discriminated. So just keep that in mind in terms of, as a background, as we talk about Josey. So E.J. Josey was born in 1924 in Norfolk, Virginia, and he was raised in Portsmouth. And between Norfolk and Portsmouth is this Elizabeth River. So he pretty much, his parents moved to Portsmouth. He was the oldest of 5 children, and he graduated from I.C. Norcom High School. Portsmouth, Virginia, which is very beautiful. It's a very beautiful area. It's in the Hampton Roads region. It was established in 1858. Primary, at the time of the research, and I would argue even today, the primary source of employment was the naval shipyard. They still have people who work at the shipyard. Actually, Josey's father worked at the shipyard. The population of Portsmouth, according to the 1930 census, was 45,000, and it was 52% African American. Josey and his family lived in the Mount Hermon area of Portsmouth, and that community was very impoverished, was highly populated by African Americans. Church life was a big part of the life there in the community. Josey himself and his family attended Baptist church. This community also highly valued education, and they had a lot of community pride. And I would have to say, in the process of conducting research, I was able to go to Portsmouth and spend some time in Mount Hermon at Josey's church and his community. And what I found was interesting, that even though and it still is very much an impoverished community, many people who came from that community went on to do wonderful things, just like Josey. We had a lot of doctors and professors and engineers who came from that particular community. So it says a lot about that community. And even though he was raised very poor, often didn't have enough clothes or a lot to eat, Josey said he never really felt poor. He felt that his mother really gave them a lot of cultural enrichment and had them sing songs and poetry. And he was big on choral music himself, but he felt that they were so rich with a lot of things in terms of educationally that he never really felt poor. Here's an image of Josey with some of his classmates at the IC Norcom High School, IC Norcom High School to the right. And IC Norcom is interesting as well because the first principal IC Norcom actually was, his name was Norcom, African American from the community of Portsmouth, who actually graduated from Harvard. So these are just images of Josey during that particular time. And here's an image of the Portsmouth Public Library in 1939. Now, even in 1939, there was segregation. So even though there was a library, Josey and other Blacks could not use the library. This building today has been refurbished or renovated, designated as a historical site, and now it's like a Black resource center in Portsmouth. And just to kind of give you a little bit of information about the life in Portsmouth, this is an image of a protest that occurred at IC Norcom High School in 1973. So here you see that there was still a lot of racial animus that was going on in the community, in the city in 1973, long after the Civil Rights Act. So after Josey graduated from high school, he graduated actually at the age of 16. He graduated early because his father passed away, and being the oldest son, he was pretty much the main breadwinner for the family. And so he took odd jobs. He sung in the chorus. He did all of that before joining the Army. And he joined the Army in 1943, and he served for World War II. And he cites to his time in the Army as being significant for two reasons. One reason was he first became aware of libraries. He was a chaplain in the Army, and so he was exposed to choral books and musical books and things like that in the library. He would go to the library. It was the first time that he actually, I recall him saying that it was the first time he actually could go to a library. So that was one thing that was very significant. The other thing that was significant is that he stood up for himself because he was approached by actually he wasn't approached. He was walking to board the bus back from camp, and one of the bus drivers told him to get out of line and pulled a revolver on him. And so that was significant for him. And he talks about that, and on page 25 in my book, he talks about how he stood up for himself, and he said, after this act, after having that revolver pulled on him, after this act, which could have resulted in my death, I became an implacable foe of segregation and second-class citizenship. And I think that's significant. I think this really kind of motivated him to fight against a lot of the injustice that he saw in the profession. But but it wasn't Josey who was the only one who experienced issues of discrimination in the Army. America has this long history of soldiers, and many of you may be familiar with the Double V campaign, where soldiers were fighting for wars like World War I, World War II in Europe, and they were not discriminated against. But when they came home, they experienced discrimination. And so it wasn't just him. It speaks to a larger issue that was going on towards Blacks during that particular time. With the benefit of his time in the Army, he benefited from the GI Bill, which allowed him to use those funds to actually, go to school. So with the GI Bill, you can use it. It's like a military benefit where you can use it to buy a home or go to school. And so he chose to use it to go to school. It's because of the bill that he was able to go to Howard University, where he received his bachelor's in music. He also used it to pursue his master's in history. So he has a master's in history from Columbia University, and he also has a master's in library science from the State University of New York. But that kind of tells you a little bit about his life prior to entering the field of librarianship. And so let's go on to talk a little bit about his profession. His first job at a library school was at the Free Library of Philadelphia. And many of you guys are probably aware that this library has been in the news, I would say, within the last 6 months about issues of discrimination. And when that was in the news, it really reminded me of my talk with Josey and how he felt like he experienced a lot of discrimination there as well. So his first job was at the Free Library of Philadelphia, 1953. And he was only there for 1 year because he felt that he was heavily discriminated against. So that forced him to leave librarianship altogether. He said, "This is not for me." And so he left and he became an instructor of history at Savannah State College. But he loved librarianship so much that he left there as well. And he was recruited by Delaware State Library to become their director. And he was director from 1955 to 1959. And he did so many interesting things there. His vision was that he wanted to bring more people into the library. And by doing that, he was able to bring in people like Langston Hughes and notable others to the library just to let people know about their services and the collection and all of that. So he was very, that really kind of put him on the map, so to speak. This is when he was always active in ALA, but his action and what he was doing at Delaware really, he started making a name for himself. And so he was there for 4 years, and then Savannah State heard about what he was doing. And he said, "Well, hey, why don't you come to Savannah and do the same thing here?" And which he did. So he left Delaware, and he was at Savannah for a number of years, from 1959 to 1966. And Savannah was in Georgia. Now, it was at Georgia, again, we're going back to some of those southern states. It was in Savannah where he experienced racism. And he had students that worked in the library who experienced racism. So he became very active in AACP outside of the profession, but he was also became the student advisor for the NAACP at Savannah State College. He participated in sit-ins and in marches, and he encouraged his students to do that as well. So one of the unique things I think about Josey is that he understood that he wasn't going to just stay within the confines of the library, where he wanted to kind of be, active, and also he knew that he wanted to have a broader impact, not just in libraries, but just in society in general. So he left Savannah State, and he became the chief bureau director at the New York Public Library. At the New York Department of Education. And then he was there for a number of years, about 20 years. And then he was professor at the University of Pittsburgh at the latter part of his career. So he had several different hats, but he was very active. He was always about recruiting for the profession. He was always about activism, and in terms of fighting against racism. He was always about fighting for women's rights. He was always about any type of injustice. He was very outspoken about it. And he wanted to change things. He wanted things to be different. So that was how he is. So so let's kind of move on to his activism in the American Library Association. And almost immediately when he graduated, he was a member of the American Library Association. One of the things that bothered him, like I said, when he was in Georgia, he wanted to be a member of the Georgia State Library Association, but Georgia State Library Association was one of the states in the Deep South that practiced Jim Crow, that would not allow Blacks membership, and that bothered him. And so that's not why he became active in the ALA, but he was already active in the ALA. He saw this injustice and he set out to correct it. So it wasn't just Georgia, it was the state of Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi. Also, these 4 states would not allow membership to their Black librarians. And so that bothered Josey significantly. And he did not really do any, well, it bothered him, but I guess it was fortuitous because in 1964, I guess in alignment or with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, he really had momentum to really kind of do something and to enact some change. And so one of the things that he did was create a resolution at a conference in 1964. And as he told me, one of the things that was going on in his mind when he decided to draft this proposal was these 3 civil rights activists who were missing, and Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, which was around a time, which was the same month of the American Library Association. And so this was in his mind. And at that conference in June, at the American Library Association in June, the state of Mississippi was being recognized for their National Library Week. And so that irked Josey significantly, which is one of the main reasons why he decided to draft a resolution. And so his resolution, and it's quoted here, but his resolution basically said, states that do not allow membership to everyone should not be affiliated with the American Library Association. And with that, so he drafted his resolution and he went on the floor and he stated his resolution. And then Eric Moon, who was the editor of the Library Journal at the time, seconded his motion. And as Josey said, all hell broke loose after that. And so basically he is attributed with actually completely integrating the American Library Association, because prior to that, they would not allow, those state chapters would not allow Blacks membership. So that was one of the most significant things that he did. And so after that resolution, which was passed in 1964, still the treatment, as he saw it, of Black members and women and other people of color, they still weren't being treated well, like in their workplaces. Like there were no opportunities for leadership positions. There were no opportunities for them to receive awards. And so, in thinking about that, one of the things that Josey did was he was one of the founders of the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. And this is modeled after the Congressional Black Caucus. And so he created this so that he can create some type of a pipeline of leadership. He also went on to, and that's significant as well, because after he founded the Black Caucus, other ethnic associations were founded thereafter. Reforma followed after, as well as APALA and other library associations. He became the president of the ALA in 1984. He advocated for equal pay for women. He authored 13 books, a limited, like up to 400 publications. So not only was he active in terms of trying to fight injustice that he saw, but he also wrote about it. And he brought it in the classroom when he went to the University of Pittsburgh, and he recruited people of color as well to the profession. So he did quite a bit in his life. He was awarded, because of all his activities, he was awarded the ALA honorary membership. He received numerous awards. There are scholarships named after him. He received honorary doctorates. His efforts to fight injustice were like endless. And he is one of the, and at least as I can recall, he's one of the few people that actually got a lot of attention outside of library world. Like he was written up in Jet magazine and Ebony magazine. He was interviewed on TV for certain publications. So he was out there making a lot of voice. He was actually a voice against injustice. So he was out there doing a lot. Again, these are some of the books that he authored as well. So I want to talk a little bit about how I actually got the data for my book, and then we'll kind of tie it up together at the end. I did considerable amount of secondary source research, considerable amount of documentary research. I went to a lot of different archives, not only his papers, which are at North Carolina Central, spent quite a bit of time there, spent a lot of time at ALA. Archives, I spent a lot of time at all the universities that he worked, at the Savannah State College, at Delaware State College. So I did a lot of documentary research. I conducted interviews of 30 plus people, his colleagues, family members, and basically traced his life by visiting his hometown and speaking to his friends and his colleagues. So I did quite a bit of work for the book. This is just an example of the list of documentary, the archives that I visited to collect the documentary research. So what can we learn from E.J. Josey? Particularly today, in today's time, where racism really still very much exists, not only just in society, but it also exists within all American institutions, which includes libraries as well. So what can we learn from E.J. Josey? One of the things that I think that is interesting about his life is that I believe that he provides a blueprint for leadership. And not so much that he has a lot of, like, if you think about, oh, he implemented a lot of these different strategies, but what I think was important about it is that he actually spoke up. When he saw something, he was not afraid to speak out against it. He wasn't afraid to call people out. And I think we need people like that to combat a lot of the racism that exists. He also is an example by looking at how he loved the profession, but he wasn't afraid to call them on it. Like one particular thing occurred within the profession is that they decided in 1970s, they created the American Library Association Intellectual Freedom Committee. They created a film called The Speaker, which casts Blacks in a negative way. And so one of the things that he did was he fought internally within the profession to not allow that film go forward. Unfortunately, it did, but he was vocal about it and he wasn't afraid to back down. I think that's really important that he was able to do that. Also, it's just a great example for us today. He was able to forge coalitions outside of libraries. I think so often we're in this bubble of LIS, libraries, archives, museums, even library faculty, we're in this bubble of not thinking beyond just our field. And I think that's one reason why he was so successful. He saw that there was injustice. He actually sought out to meet with Martin Luther King to kind of get an understanding of how he can help or maybe replicate some of his ideas into fighting for equal rights within libraries. He was very often, he was in DC, he understood that he had to change policies in order to, and he understood those policies would affect not only just, library world, but just people in general. So he was able to forge coalitions with a lot of different people. Like I said, he understood the example that I gave earlier about what he did at Delaware State College Library and Savannah State College. He brought notable people into the library. He understood by doing that, that was going to drive other people into the library. So he was able to, I think, ahead of his time in thinking about how to forge coalitions outside of libraries. He understood that the national issues were also global challenges. So he wasn't only fighting against racism in America, he fought against it overseas as well. In Africa, he was against apartheid. So he understood that we're all connected. And I think a lot of times people tend to compartmentalize, but he had a broad vision. And I think that's really, really helpful for us to understand him. And also, I think it helps us to kind of fight against a lot of the injustice that's going on today. He was persistent. He was a very gentle, kind man, but he was very persistent, and he had an agenda, and he was able to get his agenda across. He wasn't going to back down. He was also proactive. He was always a couple steps ahead of people. He knew he wanted to do this resolution. So one of the ways that he was able to get that resolution is that he had already networked with different people, part of ALA, prior to going on the floor to read his resolution. So he was very proactive. He was also passionate about just the profession. He was known for just recruiting a lot of people of color into the field. When he was at University of Pittsburgh, at that particular time in the 1980s, they were known for the University of Pittsburgh School of Library and Information Science was known for having the most people of color that were part of the graduate program for master's as well as PhD. So he was very passionate about the field. He was known for just reaching out to undergraduates at universities to encourage them to, become librarians. So he actually was very passionate about it. One of the things I heard I recall from one of the interviews from one of the his contemporaries is that basically he was all eat, slept, and always thinking about libraries. And so I just think that's very interesting. So why is this important? So what? So people may say, well, this person, he did all these wonderful things for the field, the profession, great. So what? So why is that really important? As I say, if we think about where we are today in society with all the racism that exists, we need speakers we need advocates like Josey. We need people who are not afraid to speak up and speak out. We need these programs. We need to recruit more people to the field. If we're serving these communities, librarians should represent these communities. And there's so many other reasons why his life is important, I believe. We are at a period where we're going through COVID, but we also, I think because of that, it creates an opportunity for change and transformation. So maybe it is a time that we do some rethink about how we do things. And maybe we need that bold, transformative thinking and leadership from Josey to make things better. And since LIS professionals often pride ourselves as stewards of social justice, don't we owe it to the communities that we serve and to themselves to solve these difficult issues? And oftentimes, the profession wants to become silent or neutral in these instances. Now is not the time to do that. And so Josey wouldn't do that. And I think we need to take that from him. We need to look at him. I guess I'll leave us on this final quote by Martin Luther King, who says, history will have to record that the greatest tragedy period of a social transition was not the strident clamor in people, but the appalling silence. So being silent about the issues that are going on in society is just as bad as not doing something. And I can recall particularly during this summer with the whole George Floyd incident, people were coming to me, what can you do? What can we do? And one of the things is say something and do something and don't be silent. So I guess I'll end here. I'll pause here and I'd be happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much. There are some questions. I'm going to go to them right now. Janice asked, who was or were the transformative leader or leaders in the field of librarianship who influenced Dr. Josey?
Oh, that's a great question. Edward Christopher Jones was one of the first librarians. Like he was someone who influenced Josey. When he was working at Columbia Library, this is where he decided, this is where he became interested in becoming a librarian. There was a librarian by the name of Basil Miller who influenced him. But I think he got most of his influences, to be honest with you, from people who were active in the civil rights movement. And people such as, like I said, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. He got a lot of his inspiration from them and just how they fought for injustice outside. And I think he wanted to fight, take on that same fight within the field.
Great. I have to say that what I've loved this. It's always interesting to me to learn about, where librarianship comes from and who our leaders in the field are. And one thing that I'm really taking away from this is don't be afraid to call people out and don't be afraid to speak up. And especially, we just all need to do that. We all need to do that. It doesn't need to be on one particular set of people to be doing that and to be in charge of that. We all have to take responsibility for that. There is one more question, and please feel free if anyone does have more questions to put them in the Q&A and we will get to them. This person says you've done an excellent an incredible amount of research for this book, which yes, you sure have. Have you written about your methodological process?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm actually working on that right now. So absolutely. I actually used methods of oral history for part of this book. So I have written about that methodology, but I am working on a bigger piece on the methodology.
Excellent. Well, it does not look like there are more questions right now, but you have shared your Twitter handle and the hashtag. And so I'm sure if anyone has questions after watching the recording, for example, they can perhaps tweet those to you later on. I know that I have been fascinated with this afternoon's talk. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. I have put a link in the chat to everyone for registration for the rest of the series. And then also this is the link where the recording for this session will be posted. Join us again March 18th for Kelvin Watson, and you can register at in the chat. I hope everyone has an amazing afternoon, and thank you again so much for being with us.
Thank you.